So I just want to officially welcome you to tonight's Ask Me Anything. We are going to have a carbon pricing, or sorry, a climate economics Ask Me Anything. And specifically talking about how to sway public attitudes towards carbon pricing. My name, first of all, is Tamara Staten, and I am CCL's Education and Resilience Coordinator, as well as our Greater Pacific Northwest Regional Coordinator, and I'm really happy to be able to be the host this evening and to have you here with us as well. So there's a new study titled How to Increase Support for Carbon Pricing, and it confirms previous findings that rebates or dividends greatly boost support. However, it shows that public support can be further increased by a climate premium that front loads the rebates and makes them more salient. One of the study's co-authors, Davide Pace, will discuss his team's findings as well as other cutting-edge research relevant to CCL volunteers. So really glad you're here to bring your attention and your carbon pricing research question, or your I should say climate economics, I apologize, questions. And we're going to hear, first of all, from Jonathan Marshall in just a moment, who will introduce Davide, and then we will dive right in with the content. So before we introduce Davide, I've been mispronouncing your name, apologies, Davide. I'm going to briefly introduce Jonathan Marshall, who is a former economics editor of the San Francisco Chronicle and a recent economics research coordinator for CCL. He's also the author of 7 books, including his most recent 2024 book, Carbon Pricing, Why We Need It, How It's Working, and How to Build Public Support. And this book is available online at the link that we're going to put in the chat. So that image that you were seeing on the screen, that is the cover page of his CCL book titled the same. So with that, I'm going to pass it to you, Jonathan, and we can take it away. You can take it away, actually.
Thanks, Tamara.
There you go.
And thanks to all of you for joining today's event. And the purpose of it is to learn about seminal research on a topic that's central to our mission: how to build public support for CCL's core policy of national carbon pricing. Well, a lot of what we do around lobbying and grassroots education are key tactics for building support, of course. But built into our core policy of carbon fee and dividend is a mechanism for persuasion, and that's the dividend. Carbon dividends, which are the return of revenue from a carbon fee or tax to every individual on a kind of lump sum basis, appeal to people's sense of fairness by helping low and moderate income households afford the transition to cleaner energy. They also appeal to self-interest as well, because about 2/3 of households would actually come out as net beneficiaries. That is, they would receive more income than they pay out in higher energy prices. So for both reasons, dividends should in theory build public support for carbon pricing, making our policy easier to pass and helping to ensure its long-term political viability. All this makes perfect sense, but is it actually true? Well, if CCL is going to be effective, we can't afford to guess or just suppose. We need facts. In recent years, really just in the last decade or so, scholars have started to study how dividends or other possible uses of carbon tax revenues might build support for the policy. I published a research guide to this literature about a year ago, posted on CCL Community if you want the details. In general, however, studies do indicate that carbon dividends increase support, especially if the public is informed about how they work. But so do other possible revenue uses build support for carbon pricing, like public investments in clean energy. So there's no absolute, ideal mechanism here. And it's also important to note that the impact of various policy options on public support for carbon pricing varies a lot from country to country as well. One of the most interesting recent studies looks at a new twist on dividends called a climate premium. And the idea here is that front-loading some of the dividend payout can make the program benefits more salient or visible, so the public will buy into the idea more. And I discussed this study in an essay in the latest book that Tamara mentioned, Carbon Pricing, Why We Need It, How It's Working, and How to Build Support. But you don't have to take my word for it. Today, I'm delighted to introduce one of the study's co-authors, Davide Pace, a behavioral and environmental economist at LMU Munich. I'm hoping he'll take us through that study and also discuss some of the broader literature and its implications for our mission to enact a national price on carbon. And when he's done, I'll kick off our Q&A and then open it up to general questions. So Davide, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Good. And thank you all for having the cameras on. I can really see you. So that's going to help me to see if the talk is going fine. So this is joint work with Andre Werner, Taisuke Mai, and Klaus Schmidt, three of us in LMU Munich in Germany. And Taisuke Mai instead is at the University of Osaka in Japan. Now, our starting point, and this is not turning, okay, yes, now it's working, is that, well, many economists, including Nobel Prize winners, the ones that you see on the slide, believe that carbon pricing is the most promising way to fight climate change. Why? Well, you put a price on carbon, you push people to emit less, you push people to innovate, to endorse or to use green technology. And in the meantime, if you distribute the revenues, you might actually reduce inequality or support poorer households. But the main reason why economists like carbon pricing is exactly that increasing the cost of emitting CO2, it makes people to reduce the emissions that are the least valuable. If you don't care much about taking the extra flight, you're not going to take the extra flight. But as central planner, I don't have to tell you what you have to cut. Now, while economists like carbon pricing a lot, as you know, convincing policymakers to introduce them is hard. And it's hard because many times you will see that policymakers try to introduce or increase a carbon pricing and people take the streets. People take the streets because they might think that the carbon pricing is ineffective, they might think that it hurts the poor, or they might just dislike the idea that the government is raising revenues. Big government is something people might be concerned about. Now, we have many studies on this, and a question that is natural to ask is, well, as a government, you can design a carbon pricing in many ways. One thing that you can do is to redistribute the revenues, to take the revenue you generate with the carbon pricing and use it for different types of use. And is any particular way in which you can do this good in the sense that it maximizes public support? And in general, is the revenue use an important determinant of support for carbon pricing? Now, as Jonathan was saying, we're not the first one to ask this question. There is a large literature out there that uses one of two approaches. The first one is the use of surveys. If you are a participant in this survey, you might ask an hypothetical question. This is how the government might use the revenue for carbon pricing. How much do you like this from a scale from 1 to 5? Now, this approach is great, but we also have evidence showing that asking this kind of hypothetical question overestimates support for carbon pricing. People feel good to say, yes, I like environmental policies, when they would not vote for it on the ballot box. Another approach, it's more abstract, is like designing abstract economic experiments where economists put a lot of thoughts in order to design monetary incentives in these experiments, such that people that participate in the experiments are incentivized to tell the truth. They're incentivized to tell that they like the policy, only if they really want to have it implemented. This is another great approach. The problem is that these experiments are complicated. You can only run them with college students, most of the time with economic college students, so a particular subsample of the entire population. What we're going to do here today is to combine the best elements of these two approaches and we run an online experiment where people make decisions that influence how much they earn in the experiment, but also how much CO2 they emit within the experiment. And we do this with a representative sample of the German population. Now, this is Germany. I'm going to tell you a bit towards the end why I think that you can think that these results extend also in the US or in other developed countries. Now, this is the methodological contribution. We are asking this question in a way that no one did before. But we also do something else. We test for a new way to use the revenue from carbon pricing. This is the climate premium Jonathan was talking about. And this is new in the sense that there has been some proposal in the literature to use this climate premium, but we don't know exactly how much people like it. And I will be more precise in a second about what exactly the climate premium entails. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how we go about to ask this question, so you have an idea of how the sausage is made. You get a sense of where the results come from. So we have two data collections, a main experiment and an expert survey. Let's start with the main experiment. We collected 1,100 observations using a standard online panel provider. This is data from June 2003, and our sample is representative of the German population over age, gender, region within Germany, income, and education. Now, the main experiment has three phases: a consumption phase, a voting stage, and a questionnaire. In the consumption phase, participants make two purchase decisions. This is how the first one, this one. Okay. These purchase decisions, participants can buy a virtual product, an experimental product. This product is valuable for them because every time they buy a unit of the product, they increase their earnings in the experiment. However, buying the products emits CO2. Buy a unit, you emit 6 that offsets CO2 emissions. Every time you buy a unit of our product, we reduce the size of our donation, effectively increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Can you still see me? Despite I'm connected with, I got a message that my internet connection is unstable. Is everybody on board still?
We can see you and hear you, Davide, but we
Perfect.
up for about a sentence.
Oh, you lost a sentence. Okay, so basically the idea is that you can buy a product. This product is valuable for you. You earn more money in the experiment if you buy the product, but the product generates CO2, and we set it up such indeed we have CO2 emissions if you buy the product. In the experiment, people make two purchase decisions, one without carbon pricing and one with carbon pricing, so where the price is higher and you earn less from buying the products. One of these two decisions is implemented. Which one depends on the voting stage of the experiment. In this stage, we put participants in group of 50, and we told them you need to decide for yourself and for your entire group whether you want to implement the decision without the carbon price or the one with the carbon price. And we make sure that every participant has a chance to influence the result of the entire group. In the sense that we pick one participant random for each group, and that this participant vote will determine the outcome of everybody. We have 5 conditions in which we change the way in which the revenue from the carbon price is used. In the state budget, we take the revenue, we transfer it to the federal government in Germany. Climate project, we use the revenue to finance environmental projects. Redistribute all. This is a standard tax and dividend. We take the revenue and we divide it equally among all the group members. Redistribute poor, we do the same thing, but this time the dividend is only among the 50% of participants that declared a lowest income at the beginning of the experiment. And finally, a climate premium. This is our new way of using the revenue, so let me give it one full slide. The climate premium involves giving people a certain payment. You know upfront how much you're going to get if the carbon pricing is in place. It's also given immediately. So in the experiment, we transfer it within 48 hours, rather, and together with the earnings of how much you have consumed, rather than having to wait 2 weeks. The fact that the climate premium is certain and is transferred upfront make the benefit for carbon pricing very salient and evident to people. The climate premium kind of made its way in the electoral program of a Dutch party This part is called D66, and what they proposed was something like that. We have subsidies for fossil fuel. We want to cut these subsidies. We're going to give people upfront the money that we're going to save every year. Now, unfortunately, D66 didn't do well in the last election, so we're not going to see this policy in the Netherlands anytime soon, I'm afraid. Now, to perfectly understand the climate premium, it's good to compare it to redistribute all. Redistribute all, tax and dividend, you also have a transfer. However, this transfer depends on how other people are behaving. The amount of money you get depends on more people other people consume, more money you're going to get. And when are you going to get this money? Well, can be every month, as in the Citizen Climate Lobby proposal. Sometimes in Austria, they have a version where you get the money every year. And so in the moment in which you vote in favor of the carbon pricing, you know that you have to wait and you don't know exactly how much money you're going to get. These two things together make the benefits, and so the transfer, and so the benefit for carbon pricing less salient in redistribute all than climate premium. The experiment concludes with a questionnaire. We ask many things. The most important thing is that we ask people about their beliefs about others' voting decisions in the experiment. The expert survey, we contacted 1,300 economists in German-speaking countries, so Germany, German-speaking Switzerland, and Austria. These were all the economists we could find that work on public economics, environmental economics, and behavioral economics. 28.5% of them actually completed our survey. We were very happy with the response rate. And what they did was to go through the experiment to get a sense of what people were doing. And then we asked them to predict how participants voted in the experiment. Okay? So this concludes the design presentation. Very happy to get any clarifying question at this stage.
Feel free to. Thank you, Davide. This is fantastic. So go ahead and put any clarifying questions in either the Q&A right now, or even if it's a simple, straightforward question, you can drop it in the chat. I'm seeing some questions in the Q&A right now, but they're not necessarily clarifying. Let's see, let me look at these. You said you're going to speak about how this research extends to the United States and why you don't think that Germany is.
Yes, I can say two things already. So if you look at, so there is a survey done on 20 different countries, many of them developing, and the level of support for climate policy that you find in these in the survey is very similar for Germany to the US and France, Australia. So Germany is not special when it comes to support for climate policies. And so even if we're doing with Germany, of course, maybe not everything will translate one-to-one, but Germany and the US are not so different when it comes to support for climate policy.
I think there's one concern, Davide, that some of us have, that climate change tends to be a more divisive issue in the United States than it is in Germany. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, so it is probably, well, we do have also in Germany some far-right parties that want to scrap a lot of progress made when it comes to climate change. And this is not just Germany, in Europe in general, these kind of far-right parties with not very pro-climate agendas are gaining momentum. So I would say it's not unique of the United States, it might be a bit more, but we have data from the US that people overestimate how big the gap is in terms of polarization, and how much people underestimate how much Republicans support climate policies. I will say a bit more later. We have some results in that direction, and I will elaborate further later.
Great. And one additional clarifying question is from Kathleen. What were the participants purchasing?
Oh, so this is a virtual experimental product. I hope I put it in the slide and I partly forgot. So you see a slide where you have, you can buy some boxes basically. And this box is valuable in terms of money for you. So it's very abstract setting. You say you can do something that is good for you, monetary. So we are representing whatever is good for you in money that then we're going to transfer you, but as some consequence when it comes to CO2 emissions. So a virtual experimental product, nothing that we actually ship to you.
Okay, thank you. And then Lizzie, you have a question in the chat about perverse incentives acting from the dividend recipient direction. Do you want to come on, unmute yourself and clarify your question, Lizzie?
Yes, I'm looking at the perspective, I'm in Alaska. We have the permanent fund dividend, which the oil companies have paid into. And the problem we've come up against is that people will do anything to keep those dividends. And what consideration has been given to that in terms of people who receive the dividends acting against carbon containment technology?
So, okay, so if I get it correctly, the question is, well, people are getting some subsidies that are linked to fossil fuel right now. In Alaska, if I understand correctly, there are royalties from using oil. But if you think, well, I don't know if it's in the US, but for sure in Europe, there are huge subsidies for fossil fuel usage. And we had huge protests started in Germany and then across Europe, because in Germany, they wanted to cut subsidy for fossil fuels for farmers. So I think that's particularly sensitive issue. People don't like when things are taken away from them. The study directly will not speak to that, if not for one thing, that giving money upfront to people might be something that they like. And so, this might be a way to compensate for the cuts that you have to make when it comes to subsidy for fossil fuel or subsidy from fossil fuel production. So the idea being, if you pay upfront, you get a carbon tax and dividend, you have a source of revenues, you can try to convince people that, we can cut the subsidy that comes from the oil industry. Why? Because there is this other stream of cash that comes for you.
So my question is have you looked into what will happen?
No, not directly. So what I told you about is how much it works, but we don't have that in the study.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Lizzie. Okay, Davide, those are all the clarifying questions. So go ahead and dive into your next part.
Perfect. Now, findings. This is the main graph. This is the percentage of support that each of our policy gets. Now, let's start here on the left. State budget, giving money to the federal government. This is the one that works the worst. And there must be a mistake in the graph because the support is 47%. And now I don't know why in this latest version it seems above 50%, but this is definitely the one that works the worst. Now, everything else is we get the majority support for all the other policies. So this tells us, yes, the way in which you use carbon pricing revenues is important for people support. The mechanism that works the best is the climate premium here on the right. The climate premium has 73 percentage points of votes in favor, which is 4 percentage points that redistribute all, and 10 percentage points of redistribute poor and climate projects. Now, it's also important to note that redistribute all, the normal carbon tax and dividend is doing pretty well. And so here, the idea is that, well, you don't have to scrap everything. In terms of, if you want to tell politicians, do something that people like, well, redistribute all is already doing pretty well. Maybe the climate premium can do a bit better. One thing that we were surprised about is the difference between redistribute poor and redistribute all. We were surprised about because previous research shows that, this is done with unincentivized surveys. And there you tend to see that redistributing money to the poor works better than redistribute money to everybody equally. Now, this is not the case for us. To see why this is different for us, what we are going to see is how much rich people and poor people vote in the experiment. Here I'm plotting all the different, for all other treatments, we don't see much difference. When it comes to redistribute poor, what you can see is that poor people vote in favor of the carbon pricing just the same way in which they vote in favor for redistribute all, but rich people suddenly drop support. So this is to say, why do we find the result here is different from the surveys? Well, one reason might be exactly these economic incentives I told you about. In the moment in which people need to put their money where the mouth is, support for redistribute poor seems to be dropping. Now, I also want to tell you about some other properties of the climate premium redistribute all. Reason being that when you go and talk to politicians, they might not be just interested in the average support for carbon pricing. They might be interested in the average support in their constituency. And so one thing that I want to show you about is that the climate premium and redistribute all are very good policies because they achieve majority support in every single demographic group we could check. Now here I'm just giving you some groups. Conservatives, people that self-declare are conservatives, might be slightly different what a conservative is in Europe and in the US, but we have 59% support for both climate premium and redistribute all among these groups. AfD voters, this is the far right party in Germany. These are people, I mean, the members of this party got a meeting, just to give you a sense how far right they are. These are people that had a meeting thinking about how to take people in Germany that were not of German origin and bring them outside the country. Still 59% support for climate premium, 58% support for redistribute all. People that declare a slow concern for climate change, 51% support for climate premium, 50% support for redistribute all. Here I'm not rounding it up, I'm actually rounding it down, so it's still a majority support. People living outside big cities, there is this sense that rural people might be more hit by carbon pricing and dividend. Now here a big city is 100,000 inhabitants. So everybody that is below, everybody that says I'm living in a city below 100,000 inhabitants is in this group, and we have support between 70 and 75%. Now, another thing that we recently learned in economic research is that if you ask politicians which kind of policy they prefer, they will tell you that they dislike divisive policies. If you have to have a policy that everybody saying, well, you know, it's not the best, it's not the worst, it's in between, policymakers will prefer this to another policy where you have half of the population that says this is great and half of the population that says this is the worst possible outcome. So what we can check how divisive different form of carbon pricing are, and also how divisive not having no carbon pricing at all is. And this is what I'm going to show you. This is the most complicated graph in the talk, so bear with me. Here, what I'm saying, so we have 6 policies, no carbon pricing and 5 different forms of revenue recycling. And here, let's take no carbon price. What I'm showing is that almost 20% of people think that no carbon pricing is the best possible options. And then a few think that is the second best possible option. And about 40% think is the worst possible option. So no carbon pricing is a rather divisive policy. Then you look at state budget. Well, this is basically something that no one really likes. So giving money to the state. Other policies like climate projects, well, we saw that they got quite some vote, but they're quite divisive. You have a lot of people saying that is the best possible option, and quite a few that rank it 5th or 6th out of the possible options. Now, let's look at redistribute and climate premium. Well, this look like a bit more of a compromise solution. Very few people, these are actually the 2 policies that the fewest number of people consider to be the worst. Not so many people think it are the best policy, but many people give it an intermediate rank. So I read on your website that you care a lot about, you know, being open to everybody and being responsible and kind with the people you talk with. Well, you know, redistribute all and climate premium might be a policy that brings everybody on board. Might be easier to make it bipartisan. Now, last part of the presentation is about misperceptions. How people vote. This is the same graph as before. Here it's actually correct. I don't know what happened before. So this is the 47% of support for state budget I mentioned. And here next to it, I'm going to plot the people predictions, the particular predictions of how much other people are in support carbon pricing. And what you can see all over the board, people underappreciate how much others are willing to endorse carbon pricing. Now, this is Germany, but in the US, there are papers showing exactly the same thing. It's not support for policy, but it is how much people are willing to make actions to fight climate change, and you would find these big gaps. And you find these big gaps also among conservatives. Another paper just looks at Republicans and shows that there is a majority support among Republicans for climate action, but people do not, other Republicans don't really think that this is the case, and Democrats, I think, as well. So this gap is important because that other paper I told you about with this paper looking at the US, well, they also tell you that if you correct these misperceptions, people tend to be more on board with fighting climate change themselves, and they tend to support the government to make more aggressive climate policies. So telling people, if you go and talk with someone and you tell them, look, there is much more support than you think for carbon pricing, might be a way to bring them on board with carbon pricing as well. And the gap seems to be larger for state budget, which probably is not a good idea, but also for climate premium, there is a large underestimation of how much people like it. Now, interestingly, our economic experts are a bit better than the average participants, but not much so. And this might explain why economists have been pretty poor in convincing policymakers that carbon pricing is a good idea. Now, theoretically, it's great. Then I'm the policymaker and I ask the economists, yeah, but will people support it? Well, the economists are saying no, but the economists are wrong. I mean, at least according to our data. And also the economists wouldn't, they do understand that the state budget is the worst possible option. They don't really get yet the climate premium works better than redistribute all. This also to say our results are novel and are changing what the profession should change what the profession thinks. Now, let me wrap it up. When we run an incentivized experiment with a representative sample of the German population, we show that the way the government uses revenues for carbon pricing is an important determinant of people's support for carbon pricing. That the climate premium maximizes people's support. Redistribute to all tax and dividend works just a bit worse than that, but still pretty well. Giving more money to the government is the worst possible idea. And both subjects and experts underestimate the popularity of carbon pricing. Now, let's compare what we found with other research. Jonathan told me that Adrian Fabre came and talked with you some time ago, and I think in his research, what he finds in these large surveys, he finds that, well, the state budget is very bad as well, but giving money to the environment and giving money to the poor works better than redistribute all, the tax and dividend. We find the opposite. One reason might actually be the incentives. Now, so people in our setting, people have to put their money where their mouth is. Now, this doesn't mean that we should throw away these other papers. The stake in our experiments are pretty small. We're talking about people, the max that people can earn from consumption is 7 euros. The carbon pricing is 3 euro per product. This is very different from what you would have if you implement the policy nationwide. But this is, so you can think of our results and the one from these surveys as two extremes, and the truth is going to be somewhere in between. Now, to finish with a bit of hope, if you look at the literature so far, it seems that some form of carbon pricing find majority support. So I think this is, you can read this in two ways. Either it's, in one way, is reason to hope that people are on board with the policy, and so we're going to see the policy. At the same time, we're not seeing it, so it might be that the friction is somewhere else. For example, when it comes to lobby group that are pushing in an opposite direction to the one that you are pushing to. So I think it's very important what you're doing, because farmers and the oil industry tend to be very much organized, and so it's good that there is a push on the other side. Thank you very much. I'm very, really ask me anything. If I don't know, I will say that I don't know. And this is the most important graph that we have. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Davide. As I mentioned, I'll kick this off. Let me just offer one very brief comment to your excellent presentation. In addition to underestimation by the general public and German economists of support for some of these policies, I would add that in the United States, we have a big problem with political scientists and journalists who are just convinced that carbon pricing has no chance whatever in this country, and they frequently won't even write about it, having discounted it. And I think that's a major prejudice that we need to overcome with research like this. Anyway, to my questions. Can you offer any guidance? I'm sure a lot more research would have to be done, but if we or some other group were to modify its carbon pricing policy to implement a climate premium, how large a premium would we want to make? Presumably the premium is paid for out of some portion of expected future carbon pricing revenues.
Yes.
But you don't want to spend the next 30 years of revenue on one upfront premium. So I believe that the Energy Innovation Act, which is a pending bill in the United States, maybe offers 1 month's dividend ahead of time. That's pretty small. So what guidance might you give on how big we should think here?
So I would say several years.
Okay.
So because there is one thing that is not in the experiment, but is coming out in a recent theoretical research that says, well, if you really want to have a carbon pricing that is progressive, you need to take care of poor people that are cash constrained.
Mm-hmm.
So, in order to adapt to a carbon pricing, you might want to need to change your car. You might want to change your fridge. You might want to do investment in your house to isolate it better. These things are expensive. If you're cash constrained, you cannot do it. And actually, the carbon pricing would make it harder for you because you have more expenditure, and so you have little room to adapt. So if you can upfront, I don't know, something like 4 or 5 years, we don't have calibrations yet. This is a guess estimate, but this would very much help people to transition. And so I think it's a good idea if the public budget can take on. I mean, one way in which you could do it is saying, look, we're going to upfront what we think are the next 5 years of carbon revenues. Now, if it takes long, if we get more carbon revenue than we expect, the next dividend is going to come earlier. If we get less, well, you need to wait a little bit longer. So in this way, you can be sure that the government budget that is not, that doesn't explode. You have margin of adjustment, but you still front load quite some money.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about why you think the climate premium does build support a little bit? For example, it may appeal to people's desire for immediate gratification, or it may build trust that the government actually will return the revenue, which they don't believe otherwise. What kind of things do you think account for this finding of yours?
Okay, so there are two levels. One is what we find in the experiment and more general things. So on the more general thing, I think trust is an important issue, and giving money up front actually, should solve this issue. In the experiment, we have, here it's not perfect what we're doing in the experiment, because then it's trusting the government versus trusting us researchers. But in the moment in which you might give the money up front, that helps a lot. We cannot really explain so if you don't want to do it up front, you might want to have an institution like the central bank that takes care of these things, such that it's not in the mind of in the hand of the politicians. Now, we tried to look exactly at what's driving this, but when it comes to the difference between redistribute all and climate premium, the difference is pretty small. So we do not have a lot of power. My best guess, statistical power to tease apart different explanations. My best guess that they all play a role, but one of the most important is that people can see the number in the moment in which you're making the decision. You're getting this amount of dollars. And so it makes it very clear to them what they're earning, rather than an abstract concept of a transfer.
Right. Another question, which a number of papers have touched on, is can we assume that we call it the dividend, either they redistribute all or more importantly, this climate premium, if you put this in place in the policy, that it will do all the work? Or do we need a strong public education campaign to accompany the policy?
Public education to reach which aim?
To explain the policy and what the benefits are.
Okay, I mean, let's say everything you can do to explain that helps in the sense that it helps you to put it in place. Now, the nice thing of having a carbon price in place is that people don't have to care, to think too much about their actions, if not for the price. So that helps. Unless, so it depends a little. Okay, this is a moral argument, and so it depends on what's your moral standpoint. An economist tend to be utilitarian. So what they tell to do is that, well, you're paying for if the carbon price is in place, you're polluting, then you're paying for the cost of your pollution. The government will do something with this money to compensate for your for the pollution you're generating. For example, giving money to everybody. You can take a different moral standpoint that says, well, we should minimize carbon emissions because they're bad for the ecosystem and so on. And then carbon pricing doesn't go the whole way because you can pay your way out from emitting CO2. And then you might want public education to push people to still reduce their consumption for the sake of the environment.
Sure.
But this depends on the moral standpoint, and this is up to you what you think. As an economist, I can't really give you the final answer.
What I had more in mind was, and I think, and I'm going to butcher the name, but Deschel-Pret, that OECD and international study.
Yeah.
When I could be mixing it up, but if you simply define the carbon dividend, people don't always completely grasp it. If you give them a 5-minute video on what carbon pricing is and how the dividend will come back into your pocket, you see a big jump, like sometimes 10 points in support. So it's just a reminder, I think, that some of these concepts can be a little bit, difficult for the average person, to a little abstract, and that even a brief discussion can have a major impact on support for them.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, and also people tend to underestimate, I'm going to show it to you. People tend to underestimate by how much consumption drops once you have the carbon pricing in place. So telling them that the policy is effective and consumption drops a lot, emissions drop a lot. Well, if you put together what we find, that there is this underestimation of the effectiveness of the price together with their results, that when you explain people better the policy, well, and you convince them that it's effective, people support it more, then yes, could be, public education could be a good way to increase support for carbon pricing before you put it in place, or when you have it in place, to make sure that it's not scrapped.
Right. We're certainly seeing a lot of problems in Canada, where the government's failure to make its carbon payments salient have undercut public support. My last question is if you care to comment, I was intrigued to find that one of the most kind of compelling examples of this kind of policy was actually dreamed up and enacted by Iran in 2010, when it had a huge increase in diesel prices. And of course, in countries that have had long-standing subsidies for fossil fuels, it can be politically explosive to raise prices a lot. You want to talk a bit about how they managed that? It's not the same as carbon pricing, but using this idea of upfront benefits to help pave the way for a potentially unpopular policy.
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan, first of all, thank you to you, because you show it to me. And I mean, there was a great idea of putting the money basically the savings, part of the savings from the cut on diesel subsidy was put in people's bank account, was visible but was not touchable, was frozen. And so people could see that the money was there, and the government credibly managed to make a credible statement of, well, if you start protesting and we need to scrap the cut in subsidy, the money that you see is going to be gone. And so that's, I think the idea is more generally applicable, try to make benefits salient. People are not so good in thinking about all the effects of economic policies. So if some stuff is hidden, they're not going to realize that it's there, so you're not going to support the policy.
Right. Well, with that, I'd love to throw it open to Q&A from all the participants. Willow or Tamara, do you want to
Navigate that.
navigate that?
So if you have dropped a question into the chat, if it's possible for you to add it to the Q&A just for simplicity and others' opportunity to upvote, that would be great. I'm going to start there. So the most upvoted question from Christopher is, they say that they are a CCL liaison for a Republican House member who cares most about how any law would impact small businesses.
Mhm.
I've never seen any research focusing on this question and would appreciate any information or analysis that you can provide that is relevant to that question.
Small business. A small business is close to be, if it's very small, it's close to be a household. So meaning that, well, of course, they're going to, I don't know about, first of all, I don't know of research specifically on them. If it's very small, you can consider it a household. So of course, they're going to lose because they're going to get less revenue in. They're going to, because they're selling less products. If it's a polluting small business, that's also a question. How many small businesses have a big carbon footprint? That I don't know. And then they would get the subsidy in on the other side as citizens. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have many more insights than that.
Could I just offer the observation here? They lose in one sense by paying more for fossil fuels, either directly or embedded in the goods that they buy. But when the money is recycled into the economy as dividends, either through redistribution or the climate premium, demand for their goods and services tends to go up. And that is a very powerful support for their business model. And in fact, studies have been done of the macroeconomic impact of carbon fee and dividend systems, and they show basically no negative economic impact. So I think it's very important to say that, yes, there will be some small businesses that will be hurt, but small business as a whole, there will be others that benefit from this, and small business as a whole should see no negative impact.
And the determinants of whether it's good or bad for your business depends how polluting it is.
Right.
Thanks, Davide and Jonathan. Okay, so the next question that's been upvoted is by Jaden. Could an equal or progressive dividend lose support from progressives from fear that the dividend would crowd out future or current social programs? How would one address this issue to a concerned progressive?
Okay, so this is, one way in which you can address progressive is saying this is a separate issue, right? So basically carbon taxes and general taxation, these are different things. There are theoretical papers looking at, how do we combine, there is a transfer. And so how do we combine optimal income taxation with transfer towards poor people and carbon tax and dividend? And the result is that even if you put the two policies together, in the end, the amount of redistribution is going to be similar. Poor people are not going to lose out, with one exception. if you insist to calculate the carbon price as what economists call the Pigouvian tax. So with the idea that what you want to do is to have a transfer that is equal to the average monetary cost of the of emitting CO2. Now, the problem with the average monetary cost is this one. Rich people and poor people might suffer, let's say, just to simplify things, might suffer from climate change in the same way. But rich people have less value for money just because they're rich. So the additional euro is not valued that much for them. So if you want to compensate someone rich for the same amount of climate damage, you need to transfer this person more money. And then if you take the average, you're going to have the rich people are overweighted in this average. So if you want to use this very sophisticated economic arguments, then you might reduce redistribution when you use a tax and dividend. But there is a different way. And the way is saying, look, we want to stay below, we want to reach a certain carbon target, a certain global warming target, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. This is the amount of money, this is the carbon pricing that we need to put in place in order to get there. And so this way of calculating the carbon price doesn't overweight the rich. And then you don't have these problems when it comes to redistribution.
Could I just add very quickly, there's probably no climate policy offered out there that is more progressive than carbon fee and dividend. If you look, for example, at current federal subsidies for clean technology like electric vehicles and solar and so forth, there was just a paper done on that by 2 University of California scholars. And overwhelmingly, the benefits are skewed to the rich. With carbon fee and dividend, the benefits are very strongly skewed towards the low income side, which is why people like Bernie Sanders were huge supporters of carbon taxes until they decided that politically they might not be viable. So progressives are on board with the concept. We need to persuade them with research like Davide's that in fact, it's politically viable.
Thanks,
And
John.
through the efforts of CCL, we can help prove that as well.
Yeah, great point. Okay, so the next most upvoted question, John Gage is asking, referencing Canada, how 80% of the households are coming out ahead from the national carbon fee and dividend policy that has been in place for several years, but there seems to be confusion among the public about it and decreasing public support due to disinformation and marketing from fossil fuel interests and politicians who are speaking on behalf of the fossil fuel industry. How much do you think that the lack of support for a carbon fee and dividend is due to the policy details like climate premium or not? And how much of the resistance is coming from disinformation and propaganda against any carbon pricing policy from fossil fuel interests and the front groups that they fund?
So I would say the point of designing a climate premium or generally make communication very clear when it comes to the benefits is to remove space for any sort of disinformation. So I think that's if you design the tax well, to be clear for people where the benefits are, and it's going to be harder for anyone that wants to push the other way, spreading fake news, to do that, because people know what's going on. They see it in their bank account every now and then.
Great, thanks, Davide. And wouldn't a large carbon premium be highly inflationary, creating demand all at once while the supply of non-carbon based products would not be initially available?
Yes, one way to go about this is to announce it today, but implement it, both the carbon price and the climate premium, in a few years. In this way, companies can adapt and be ready to supply the products when the money comes in.
Great, thanks. Okay, so this next question is by Paul, who says that they don't know the intricate details of the fee and dividend policy that CCL supports, but can we show in very simple terms how to demonstrate that we can pull out 1.8 million of our citizens from abject poverty? Statement from 2018. What was the number from 2024? That's the first question.
That's for you, Jonathan.
Right. And I don't have that at my fingertips. I can pull out in a few minutes. There have been quite a few studies, and I could pull out one or two charts on how such a policy would affect each income decile, that each tenth of households in terms of their income. And you find a big positive impact on the lowest income, because just pick a number, let's say it's $300 a month as a dividend. That money is going to mean a lot more to a household that's making $10,000 a year than to a household making $100,000 a year. So it doesn't, the actual numbers don't matter so much as the concept that it's a very, very strongly progressive policy. As to how many it pulls out of poverty, poverty is a single number. So you're pulling people over a line, and that's a bit arbitrary as to where you draw that line, how you define poverty. It would be significant, but I can't give you an exact number off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Davide, I'm not sure if you know much about the Prove It Act that is in the United States Congress right now.
No, not really.
Okay, so we're going to skip that question for now based on the amount of time that we have, and see if we might be able to come back to it. But for now, let's ask the question that Sydney has in the Q&A. Do you have an idea of how much money American households would see monthly if we implemented a fee and dividend with a climate premium?
Well, it depends a lot on the size of the dividend.
Of the
And the
fee.
size
So
of
I
the carbon
think, yeah, I
tax.
mean, I know in Austria they're giving something like it's a base of 120 per month, and then they per year, and then you top it up, depending on whether you are living in the countryside or in a city. Because one thing I think it's important to add to what Jonathan was saying before is that you need to be careful that there is a lot of heterogeneity in every income decile. Some people, it's true that people, on average, people that are richer pollute more, generate more CO2 emissions. But do you have some poor people that are polluting a lot because they're living in inefficient houses? So there's also that aspect that one needs to consider. But maybe, Jonathan, you have more details for the US.
CCL actually has a household, I think, dividend calculator. And of course, it all depends on what your level of your carbon fee is. As it grows over time, so will government revenue grow. Eventually, it will start to shrink as people move away from fossil fuels. It would be, right, here, by the way, is Austria. They're getting paid about 500 euros, maybe $520 in their climate bonus. And I'd have to go look on CCL's community pages where there's some calculators and sample charts. But I think a family of four might see $3,000 to $4,000 in annual payments from a carbon fee and dividend. Not the climate premium, but the basic dividend, which Davide refers to as redistribute all. So that's real money.
Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so it looks like we don't really have any more time for questions, unfortunately, this evening. However, let me go ahead and steal the screen share back and just wrap us up for the evening. Let me get rid of these charts on my page. But you guys have been a fantastic audience with great attention and some wonderful questions. So I can imagine that more questions may arise for you as you're continuing to think or talk about this. So a fantastic way to get your questions answered as they come up is in the Nerd Corner on CCL Community. So that's cclusa.org/nerd-corner. Jonathan and many other people with fantastic information participate in the Nerd Corner, and we invite you to go check out that space as well. It is a public space. It's open to anybody, regardless of their volunteerism or membership within CCL. Go ahead and click on the magical link that we will drop into the chat. And you just by clicking that, then you can log your training. There are future reference there. You can also log any of your trainings with the big green button in our traditional training format or our log your training section in our interactive trainings. And you can also log trainings and other actions through the action tracker by going through the chapter and volunteer development door, typing out the first 4 letters of the training, and then scrolling down to the name of the training, which in this case happens to be Economics of Fee and Dividend. So that is all we have for you this evening. Kudos to those of you who are on the line doing climate and economics at 9 o'clock in the evening. So kudos to you. And Davide, I think it's 1:30 in the morning for you. So kudos to you
Yes.
and talking about both climate and economics in the middle of your night. So thank you everybody for being here. If you want to find tonight's recording, Willow's going to drop those links in the chat if she hasn't already, as well as the Nerd Corner and the Climate Science Basics training. And until then, we wish you well and have a wonderful evening. Feel free to unmute and say goodbye. And in the meantime,
Thank you everybody for attending, and Tamara and Jonathan for organizing.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.